What does this have to do with this? What attracted me to Marxism a while back, I now understand to be cultural Marxism. The short course is that the communist agitators found the working class to be far more parochial than they had thought, and they needed some additional support to further their communist revolution. In fact, in the USSR, during the first election, the Bolsheviks only received about 25% of the vote, and in response, Lenin promptly abandoned that Congress. I like revolutionary times in history because it puts on full display just how hollow the fantasy of the state is and how quickly and without much fuss the authority figure, in this case Lenin, can manipulate that fantasy. And so the Frankfurt School advocated using various oppressed groups to carry through the communistic economic revolution. The working class wouldn't be enough. I believe this is partly why atheists, racial minorities, and sexual deviants tend to support communism. What was that? Well, that's a fairly large claim of mine. Let's look at the 10 planks of the Communist Party. 1. Abolition of private property and the application of all rents of land to public purposes. This occurred with zoning laws and property tax. This is the state telling people what they can do on the land, and they have to pay a rent to the state, which is called property tax. It's rent. You don't own it. There is no private property in the U.S. anymore. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. This is 1916 and the estate tax. 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. This is the expatriation tax, the 1997 Terrorist Crime Bill, Executive Order 11490, Sections 1205 and 2002. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. That's the Federal Reserve and the FDIC. The current TARP program will function as a further increase in the state control of banking and lending. It went like, the banks are failing. We need to bail them out or we're going to a depression, which is of course not true, but that was the lie, which led to a bailout, and this bailout, this TARP program, had a lot of strings attached to the banks, and these strings gave state power over the banks. 6. Centralization of the means of communications and transportation in the hands of the state. This is the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the Department of Transportation. The Commissions Act of 1934, the Interstate Commerce Commission established in 1938, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, already said that, state-mandated driver's license, and Department of Transportation regulations. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, to bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but read controlled or subsidized rather than owned. This is easily seen in the Desert Entry Act, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce and Labor, the Department of Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Mines, National Park Service, and the IRS control of business through various corporate regulations. That's what this actually means. 8. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. This tended to not be very popular in the U.S. as direct central planning of production of goods and services tended to always lead to disaster. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over the country. See zoning laws and urban renewal. Again, this doesn't sound so bad per se, but it's done by coercion. See plank number 7. And 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. No need to even go into that. And the abolition of child labor in the factories. I would recommend reading up on the Industrial Revolution and actually looking at what options these children actually had. And what's more is nowadays that's really not even an issue in current Western countries. So we can see that for the most part the Communist Party platform has been largely implemented. So when I say X person is a communist, just look at the Communist Party platform. It's pretty unambiguous that the world is full of communists. For me personally, when I went to high school, I really was starting to outgrow the whole God thing. the whole fundamentalist, Book of Revelations thing, and was finally admitting to self that I thought guys were kind of cute. So I became a libertine, and for whatever reason, the folks I hung out with advocated the planks of the Communist Party. I mean, not explicitly, but they tended to lean that way. I didn't think much of it until I started to read about cultural Marxism. And when I first read about cultural Marxism, I actually thought it was kind of a good thing. These communists have a vision, and they were willing to make room for people like me. And so I started reading about Marx and Lenin and all the very first the very first communists who used religious arguments. That's right. The first communists were actually religious folk, which became a secular workingman's movement and then became tolerant of hedonism and weirdos like me. And I saw this as a progression, a clear pattern of improvement, which made me think communism was a movement in flux that progressed and seemed to make attempts at progressing throughout its history. And that made me more forgiving of its failures, because I recognized, yes, that was what they did back then, but they're progressing. They're always looking for, they're always changing with they're responding to their failures. Now, I don't know exactly how much impact the Frankfurt School has had in advocating central planning among the cultural left, which is cultural Marxism. I imagine it had more to do with the underdog syndrome. That is, underdogs have an affinity for each other, and in 1950s America, the libertines and the communists were both underdogs disliked by the Christian conservative majority, and I think the advancement of cultural Marxism had less to do with the Frankfurt School than it had to do with things like the Vietnam War. Perhaps it was both, that the Frankfurt School influenced some people, who then during the Vietnam War were able to flare out and influence even more people. But however it happened, cultural Marxism and the bulk of the Communist Party platform has succeeded. Really, one would intuitively expect the cultural left to advocate free markets. And for a while, I thought this is what left libertarian meant. But it's not. Left libertarianism is just authoritarian douchebaggery, that's all. And I have zero solidarity with anyone who calls himself a left libertarian. For me personally, it was plank number 10 that really started to turn me away from communism. It treated me like a piece of industrial livestock, and then I began to study neoclassical economics, which admittedly is full of plenty of faulty assumptions. But just even studying that economics, I recognized what the communists were saying was just plain insane. And after this, I began to see just how lucky I was as a protected minority. I would say I was gay, and I would get more sympathy than outrage from people, at least publicly. So, who was really oppressed? Well, who was really oppressed would be the non-protected minorities, and that would be the right-wing separatists. I apologized for them for a long time, and listened to their arguments sympathetically for a long time, because I recognized that as a non-protected minority, and a greatly demonized minority, and I listened to them for a long time before going native. And white nationalists do get a lot of things right. I know many people don't like it, but very little of what I said when I called myself a white nationalist could be labeled incorrect. More that it was incomplete, or narrow, or small in its analysis. So that's just me, in case anyone wants to know more about me. And when you wonder why there seems to be a difference between old-timey macho socialism and fabulous socialism, it's because of cultural Marxism. So to people who claim I'm attacking left libertarians as cultural Marxists, shut up. And yeah, I'm talking to you, Sean. On a semi-related note, to all folks who believe that their preference set is philosophically or epistemologically correct, you will not win the day with preferential politics. You can only win the day by growing up and recognizing that different people like different things, and they're not deranged for doing so.